Madam President, the amendment from the junior senator from Tennessee would lower the non-defense discretionary cap established in the Budget Control Act by $20 billion in order to offset transfers from the general fund necessary to replenish the Highway Trust Fund. This amendment, Madam President, is a clear violation of the Budget Control Act we agreed on less than a year ago. In simple terms, the amendment would impose a 4% cut to non-defense discretionary spending in order to pay for a shortfall in mandatory spending. I wish to remind my colleagues, Madam President, that discretionary spending will rise at a rate that is less than the rate of inflation over the next decade, and that's according to the CBO. Mandatory spending, on the other hand, is slated to rise at 3 times the rate of inflation. Clearly, if there is a desire to offset one area of mandatory spending, the place to find such an offset should be on the very same mandatory side of the spending ledger. In an op-ed published in the Washington Post yesterday, Senator Corker said that finding an offset for Highway Trust Fund was a small step towards fiscal responsibility, and that we should all support this amendment. But, Madam President, in the opening portion of the editorial, the senator noted the solid bipartisan support in the Senate for a balanced approach to real deficit reduction. This balanced approach, would include revenues, mandatory spending, and discretionary spending. And I agree with the senator that only a balanced approach will truly solve our long-term challenges. And yet, in this amendment, what do we find? Cuts, nothing but cuts to non-defense discretionary spending. No revenues, no mandatory spending, just the same approach that we have seen again and again from our Republican colleagues. Cut discretionary now, and we'll do other things at a time to be determined later. Even the Ryan budget did nothing to Social Security or Medicare for 10 years, but the cuts to discretionary spending and to Medicaid programs that saved lives of hundreds of thousands of elderly and children living in poverty took effect immediately, not 10 years. And that is the approach of this amendment. Clearly, there was an opportunity to present a balanced approach. The senator could have proposed modest cuts to spending with increased revenue and changes in the rules that would lead to a fully funded Highway Trust Fund for years to come. But that would require hard work, Madam President, and compromise. And this amendment requires neither. Across the board, across the board cuts to discretionary spending are easy. This amendment, Madam President, is one page. Change one, and that's it. We can all go home and say what a great job we've done cutting down. But the truth of the matter is that when it comes time to implement these cuts, agencies will be forced to look at reductions in force, at deferring desperately needed maintenance and repairs. And if you're considering upgrading your technology to better serve the American people, you can forget about it. 4% is no small matter. Coming on top of flat budgets for the past 2 years and with no increase for inflation or population growth. As with so many amendments we have seen in the past year, non-defense spending is again targeted because it is good policy, but also it's an easy policy. And as I've done on each of these past occasions, I once again urge my colleagues to reject these unreasonable and reckless cuts and to vote no on the Corker amendment. And Madam President, if I may, I'd like to speak on another amendment. Madam President, in September of 2011, this Senate rejected an amendment very similar to the one offered today by the junior senator from Oklahoma. At that time, members saw this amendment as a backdoor attempt to remove more from discretionary accounts that had been agreed to the deficit budget cuts. Nothing has changed in the intervening 6 months, and we should again reject this amendment for the same reason. It violates the deficit reduction agreement reached last fall. Senator Coburn claims that the purpose of this amendment is to reduce duplicative programs. But in reality, the amendment will require a $10 billion reduction in existing discretionary caps, regardless of whether there actually are $10 billion in discretionary savings from consolidating duplicative programs that can be identified only by the OMB. Further, the $10 billion figure is completely arbitrary and almost certainly will not be reached. In fact, there is no methodology or specificity that verifies that there are, in fact, $10 billion in discretionary savings to be found. The Senator's amendment cites 2 reports from the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, on how programs may be duplicative or somewhat duplicative could be streamlined or eliminated. Madam President, what the Senator fails to mention is that the GAO, in its recent report, notes that on 81 issues it raised last year, the Congress or the executive branch have begun to respond to all but 17 of the issues raised. This amendment also ignores the fact that the majority of the items on which no action has been taken are unrelated to discretionary spending, but cover revenues and mandatory spending. Moreover, in reviewing the details of the tens of billions that GAO indicates might be saved by eliminating duplication, it is apparent in those areas in which GAO has provided somewhat auditable estimates that the bulk of the savings are in 3 categories. These categories are raising revenues, cutting mandatory spending, and cutting defense. For example, 18 recommendations in 2 reports would come by cutting defense programs, including military retirement, health care, military compensation. Furthermore, $2.5 billion in annual savings would come from Social Security, and at least $10 billion from eliminating tax expenditures or making other changes to the tax code. Madam President, my colleagues on the other side have not demonstrated any zeal for cutting defense or raising revenues. And frankly, Madam President, neither side has expressed much willingness to cut mandatory spending. Instead of targeting tax increases or mandatory spending, this amendment once again goes after the easy target, which is domestic discretionary spending, the same target that is attacked time after time, even though it only represents 15% of the federal spending. So, Madam President, we have once again an amendment offered by the senator from Oklahoma, which has become a familiar pattern in this Senate. On its face, The amendment might seem to have some value, but the details of the amendment show that the amendment is a Trojan horse, a disguise with the goal of indiscriminate cutting discretionary spending without any real base or justification. In other words, this is simply another attempt to circumvent the deal that we reached less than a year ago on spending cuts for fiscal year 2013. Understanding that Senator Coburn doesn't believe those cuts went deep enough into discretionary spending, I and many of my colleagues we believe that they went too far. But in the end, Madam President, a deal is a deal. We must honor the agreement reached by leadership and signed into law by the President. Is it really in the best interest of the American people or this institution to force vote after vote on discretionary spending levels because one side did not get everything they wanted in the Budget Control Act? Clearly, the duplicative programs targeted in this amendment are nearly the frosting on a cake of spending cuts to any number of programs that the Senator does not approve of. But let us be clear. The objective here is no better government. It is cutting discretionary funding to programs that Congress supports, hiding under the guise of good government. Madam President, setting aside the real intent of this amendment, the irony of the Coburn amendment is that the amendment itself is redundant and duplicative of existing rescission authority, which has been in the law since 1974, the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of '74. This act has been successful in addressing the very situation. Setting aside this irony, the problem with this amendment is that by circumventing a well-thought-out process that recognizes the checks and balances between the executive branch and the legislative branch, it simply turns over all decision-making in terms of which programs are duplicative to the Office of Management and Budget, with absolutely no deference to Congress and the programs authorized by Congress. Madam President, the Senator from Oklahoma is constant in his efforts, in his efforts to weaken Congress's power by shifting out our responsibilities to the executive branch. And Madam President, I will remain constant in pointing out to my colleagues why this is a bad idea. The power of the purse is the single most important check on the power of the executive branch. And every time we chip away at that power, we chip away at the founding fathers' vision of how our government should operate. In addition, we are also dodging our accountability to the American public. The Congress should be held accountable for the tax dollars we appropriate and the tax dollars we receive. In closing, Madam President, we should reject this amendment because it makes no sense to reinvent the wheel, and in this case, an inferior one, when we are trying to address duplication in government missions. And we should reject it because it violates the spirit, if not the letter, of the Budget Control Act, which was signed into law 8 months ago. Finally, we should oppose this amendment because it fails to attack the real culprits of our economic woes: revenues and mandatory spending. And therefore, Madam President, I urge a no vote on this Coburn amendment. I yield the floor.